emergency response planning.
Natural growth and a little bit of net migration gain.
So I thought I'd just do a little bit of an introduction about me. And I thought, now I started work in 1982, which is 34 years ago, and I wondered if there was anybody in the room that was born before 1982, or am I really that old? Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah, well, thank you, Tens. I see a hand, yeah. So I've been working for a while, for 34 years, and I worked for the first part of my career in territorial local government in New Zealand, initially as a roading and transportation design and construction engineer. And then I did about 5 years in urban water supplies and then 10 years in wastewater and stormwater drainage. And towards the end of that period, I got 1996 is when we started writing asset plans in New Zealand. And I wrote some for the council I was working for at the time that were then peer reviewed as equivalent of New Zealand's best practice. And shortly thereafter, I decided it was probably time I went and did other things. So I started a consulting firm, and for the last 18 years, I've been consulting right around New Zealand, up into the Pacific and in Australia, in asset management planning, strategic asset management, reviews, asset information systems. Last time I had a count up, I'd been involved in over 100 AMPs being written, which is a lot. And I do a lot of peer reviews of AMPs, so about 150 additional ones I've peer reviewed. And that sounds like a lot, but you know, a council might have 10 in a suite, or 7 or 8, depending on how many they've done. So it's not hard to get up to those sorts of numbers. So I've seen a lot of asset management planning in New Zealand, and I've seen the Australian stuff, I've seen the UK stuff, I've seen the North American plans as well. So I've got a fair handle on what practices worldwide in terms of asset plans. And so I thought I would start by just talking about what are they. And essentially they've developed over the last 20 years as a structured methodology for presenting information about infrastructure assets and their management. And as I said, in 1996, we started them in New Zealand. The Australians had started a little bit earlier than us. Maybe the earliest ones they did were the early 1990s. And they've developed from that. So they're lined up in New Zealand with the political cycle. So every 3 years we have a requirement to update them. It was interesting, the North Americans, when I was talking to them, I said, why 3 years? That seems a bizarrely short period of time. And then he said, oh, because our political cycle is 3 years. I said, oh, so we should do them every 4 years. Yes. And the Brits do them every 5 years because their political cycle is a 5-year political cycle. So the reality is the interval between updating is often dictated by an in-country political cycle. And even in like the communist China, where in reality they don't have changes of governments, they still have the People's Congress every 5 years. So you would still be doing, if you're working in like a country like that, you would still line it up with political events, essentially. They've evolved over the last 20 years since they were started, and we've tried stuff, we've tried ways of doing things that has or hasn't worked well. So what I'm presenting now is the evolution of 20 years of practice development as to the best way to present this information. Now, there's a heap of resources available, and I just pulled everything off our shelves for a photo for a conference a year ago, and took a photo. And so one of the key resources is this thing here, and I don't know if you've come across it, which is the International Infrastructure Management Manual. That's co-produced out of New Zealand and Australia. It has sections in it for US, Canada, UK and South Africa, and it's updated about every 4 years, 4 to 5 year update cycle. So this is the 4th iteration of it, I think. The first one was in 96. There's another one in the early 2000s. There was a mid-2006 one, 2011, this one at 2015. And that should be available somewhere around campus if you are wanting to look at it, and it's certainly available. I think 10 says it's in the library or something like that. So that's a toolkit of how to do things. I'm a section author of 2 sections in it. One of my colleagues who I work with is a section author of another one, so we've authored 3 subsections there. The other one you really need to know about is this thing here, which is ISO 55000. So that's an international standard, and it's asset management. And it has 5000, 5001 and 5002, as these standards do. It's a ISO management standard, if you know about ISO management standards. So ISO 9000 series for quality management, 14,000 for environmental management. This one's the same sort of thing. So it sets out a management framework for asset management. It's got 77 thou shalt, you shall do this statements in there. And so that's sort of the overriding international framework. The thing with ISO standards is you can do them and then be audited on them and have a very strict audit and updating process for them. Big organisations tend to do that. Smaller ones will go, hey, I like what's in there. We'll follow the principles and the objectives, but we won't go through the whole auditing process. Now, this 2015 update, one of the primary drivers of this update was to align it with the ISO, because the ISO came out in 2014. So all the way through this, there's go see this chapter or this section of the ISO. So what we did was we created the cross-links between the international manual and the ISO. There's also practice notes, and the Australians put out a lot of those. There's individual guides, so like valuation, depreciation, optimised decision making, levels of service guides, things like that, available in the industry. And then the other thing is obviously there's legislation that you have to comply with, and individual industries have templates. So I'm doing some work right at the moment with Otago University, facilities asset management for all their properties, and the Tertiary Education Commission is the governing body for universities, and they have a template for asset management plans. District health boards have a different one. Education in New Zealand, as in primary and secondary education, have 5 and 10 year management plans which have their own template. So electricity has a different one. So the Commerce Commission and the Electrical Commission have a requirement for asset plans that dropped out of the Auckland power crisis some years ago, and they have a slightly different standard. So the key thing to know about them is they're not all uniform. Different industries have different guides. So this diagram here is straight out of the ISO, and up the top here you have your stakeholders, you have your organisational plans and objectives and a policy, you have a strategy, and we're going to talk more about the strategy in the next lecture, and then you have asset management plans at this level here. So asset management plans fit inside a continuum that goes from governance and strategic planning down into the asset plans. Then you have the implementation and what you're actually doing on your asset portfolio. Over here, the system and any plans for support. This might be a renewal plan or something like that. Now, if you have come from a background where there's master plans, so that's South Africa in particular, and a lot of the Asian countries have master planning in their engineering, master plans sort of fit alongside asset management plans. They achieve different purposes, but they sort of, in this hierarchy, they would both sit there at the same level. So if you run into a master plan and you go, well, where does an asset plan fit? They're sort of two parts to two hands to a glove, to a body or whatever. An asset plan contains some of the information that you would expect in a master plan, but at the same time a master plan has a lot more focus on capital development and forward-looking of that in detail. So again, ISO 55000, and that's where asset plans fit. This is a diagram of a typical structure within an asset management plan, and these ones I've lifted out. So my consulting organisation, we've done asset plans for whole countries, being Pacific Islands, Tokelau and Niue, and we've also did one recently for the entire Solomon Islands school system. And so this was the format that we synthesised and used out of all of those. So starting at the top, you have an executive summary, and then an introduction, a description of the service, and so that's what have we got, basically, a high-level overview of what you're actually managing, the number and type of assets, those sorts of things. Then you have your strategy, goals and objectives, and so that's set by national and regional policies and plans and things like that, and local ones. And then demand and planning for the future. And if you're in an area where there's three scenarios you look at there, or three things you run into. You might be in a very high growth area, so right across Asia, India, Africa, South America, for argument's sake, even in the bigger Pacific towns, you've got massive people coming in from the countryside into the urban area. London, for instance, same sort of thing in the big American cities. So they have lots of growth. So one scenario is you're dealing with a lot of ongoing growth. How do you provide infrastructure for that? The other scenario is, hey, it's just we're reasonably static, we've got a little bit of growth, but there's not really any pressure for growth or anything like that. The third scenario, and this is happening in the middle of the US, it's happening up in the outlying areas of Canada, the Midlands and smaller towns in the UK, and Germany, East Germany particularly, but Germany and Holland, is and starting to hit here, and it's to do with demographic change and ageing population, but you get the situation where you get massive population decline, the rural areas in Asia and Africa and South America, where people are leaving that area. And so you still have infrastructure there that needs to be managed, but if you've got declining population and declining use, you're going to have declining money ultimately. So that's the hardest scenario to manage. Growth has its own challenges, but managing a reducing population where you've still got agricultural, mineral production or whatever there, or power production, you're still going to maintain infrastructure, but there might be less of a willingness to pay for it. So those are the sorts of scenarios. The other thing that drops into that is can be climate adaptation and climate change, though you can also deal with that under sustainability. So just depending on where you want to put it. But obviously technological change and climate change also are going to change future demand. So in terms of sustainability, you have a section on that, just what you're doing about it, what you're adapting and changing infrastructure in terms of that. You have lifecycle management, which is actually, so all of that information is feeding into lifecycle management, which is looking at the assets and managing them through the entire life cycle and then renewal and again. Risk management, your processes and practices, i.e. how you're actually managing and what systems and processes have you got in place to do that. Then an implementation, because asset plans are never finished and there's always gaps and there's always heaps and heaps of assumptions. So this is around how do I resolve those and how do I get on and improve the information. Financial projections, and bearing in mind this is a forecast, asset management plans are a stock take of existing and a forward forecast of future. And then appendices, and generally in appendices you would put detailed asset information and maybe detailed risk information and that sort of stuff there. So the thing is, I'm going to take you through, the next few slides are on steps in preparing an AMP, and these steps are based on my experience over the last 20 years, and they come out of a paper that I produced last year at the IPW International Conference, was also the International Federation of Municipals Engineers Conference. And it was run by the Australians, so it would be like, I won Best Paper, it would be like the Australian cricket team saying to New Zealand, oh, well done, you know. It just was one of those things I wasn't expecting, so I was quite happy about that. And I've had a lot of feedback from colleagues in the industry that the next three slides that you can see really do hit the mark quite nicely in terms of the process. But the key thing to remind, and why I've got the spiral staircase, is that when I started in 1996, I thought, yeah, great, write an asset plan, done, move on to the next thing. And it's not like that. What happens is the minute you do one, you realise what you don't know. And there's an awful lot of assumptions, there's a lot of things you don't know, and that assets aren't static, they're changing systems, they're changing dynamics. If it's transportation, you know, your ratio of heavies or large trucks could be changing, your distribution, your use of the roads could be changing, the damage that's happening on the roads could be changing, all of those sorts of things. I mean, down where I live in the South Island, we've had a lot of dairy conversion going on. So we've gone from dry stock where maybe you had one truck every 2 weeks to 2 dairy tankers a day, or 5 or 10 going up a road. So you start getting a real big change in terms of the use and loading on the road. If you're looking at roads, same with utilities and things like that. So what happens is that you write the first one and then you go, oh, there's so much stuff we don't understand and so many assumptions. So you get this spiral, this iterative spiral of understanding as you learn more and understand more. The thing is that there's always trade-offs between demand and service levels and risk, and so they're quite a lot of uncertainty in that as well that you have to model. So it is a process. It's not a one hit, which is what your first inclination might be when you first look at them. So this is from this paper a year ago. The reason I produced it was we were getting, I think our industry, the practitioners were getting the situation where they were going through all those manuals and there was just too much information and too much complexity. And what I wanted to do to say to people is you're getting so buried in technical complexity, which engineers love doing, that you're missing the big pictures and the big trends, and you need to pull it back out and simplify it a bit. So this was me saying, hey, we're getting too complex. There's some places you have to. You might need to model something, but you don't need to all of the time. And so the first assumption that I didn't show on the slide is that down the bottom or up the top is that you've got a really, really good asset inventory. So you know what you've got and you know what condition it's in and you know how it's performing. So that was a baseline assumption that I didn't bother putting into the slide. So, but just know it's there. You must know what you've got before you can, to a degree. I mean, you can start with very loose information, but as you get into it, you need good inventories and you need good condition and performance information on your assets. There are three components. So lifecycle asset management is the engine room of an asset plan. But there's three things that modify or change that or you need to consider before you consider your lifecycle management. And the first one, critically, is levels of service. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that and some future slides. But the reality with levels of service is that this is what you're trying to deliver to your community. It's what people are paying for. So you need to know, and often they're set out by government or by a permit or a license or by a national service standard or whatever. So often you don't get a lot of choice in them, but you do need to know what you're trying to deliver because that's what you're measuring everything against. And at the end of the day, all of the life cycle management and everything else is to go, we're delivering that level of service. And when we first started these things 20 years ago with levels of service, all we did was we wrote down what we were doing. Because before that, there'd been no such thing as levels of service. So we said, well, what's all the things we do on a road, or what's all the things we do on a utility, or what's all the things we do with a facility or a park or whatever. So they started at, hey, this is what our current practice is, essentially. And then from there, they've developed to, well, that's fine, but what do people actually want? And so you can go through that, and then you go, well, people want everything and they don't want to pay anything. So I want the world and I don't want to pay for it. And we did customer surveys and got those sorts of answers. Oh, I want a road that's so smooth that I never hear my car tyres turning, but I don't want to pay anything. Well, now we've got a problem. So the thing is that you get this disconnect between willingness and affordability, willingness to pay and affordability and service. This is always a tension, doesn't matter where you are. And so then it's working your way through that and getting a series of service levels that people are happy with and are also prepared to pay for. Future demand is about, is the demand for the services growing? Is it staying the same? Is it decreasing? Is it growing in one part of your network and decreasing in another? It's around congestion, so to use the Auckland example, do I have enough roads, do I have enough capacity? And it's around managing demand, okay? So it can be around, in transportation, it can be around tolling, it can be around the sort of stuff that London's doing, where if you come into the inner circle, you pay an absolute fortune. It can be around pollution control and things like that as well. All of that sort of stuff all comes into this future demand management area. So the answer as an engineer is not always, well, it used to be, oh, we've got demand, we'll build something. Now you go, well, hang on, can we modify that demand? Is it only peak demand? Are there ways of spreading the demand? And so those sorts of things. So it's around, there's a whole field of study just in how do you manage demand. And then what does that do to the assets? So one of the things that asset management planning's taught us is just how expensive assets are, because we now can measure the cost of them through the whole life cycle. So it used to be you go, oh, we'll build a road, or we'll build a bridge, or we'll build a water supply. Cool, that's $10 million or $100 million. Good, what's the next project? Well, no, it's not $100 million. That's just the initial purchase cost. There's the cost of servicing the money, so there's the whole finance cost, there's the cost of operating and maintaining and replacing that asset, and the whole of life cost of that $100 million asset might be $500 million. And so you start going, well, actually, no, they're quite expensive, so if we don't have to build one of those, we shouldn't. And so you start looking at those sorts of things. Now, risk is the other thing, and we'll talk a little bit about that, because engineering risk in itself is a reasonably simple concept, and I'm sure you've covered it in your studies somewhere, but the trade-off between service levels, between demand, between failure risks and service delivery risks, so you can have absolute failure through natural event or disaster or whatever, or collapse, but there's also the failure to provide service, there's business failure, there's the knock-on costs of failure and stuff like that. So there's some quite interesting interrelationships between these, and then what I do in terms of lifecycle management to manage those risks. So some of those risks you can never manage. If you get a big earthquake or a big volcanic eruption, not much you can do about it. You just go, well, what do we got left? And where do we go from there? Exactly what we did in Christchurch. But you can do things to armour systems or harden them up or provide alternate capacity or things like that. And I mean, one of the classic examples in Christchurch was prior to the earthquakes, the electricity provider had done some risk analysis, and they'd gone, oh, hang on, our substations aren't quite as good a design. If we had a decent earthquake, our substations, buildings would fall down, and some of our electrical gear isn't tied down quite as well as it could be on plinths and things like that. Let's just do quite a simple exercise. We'll just get in there and do some, almost operations and maintenance work to fix up those buildings, and we'll just make sure that all of our electrical kit is tied down well for earthquakes. And they'd done that prior to the earthquake. So when the earthquakes come through, they didn't lose their substations, which meant they lost lines, but lines are quick. You can get them back reasonably quick. You lose a substation because everything falls over and arcs and burns. It takes you, months to get it back. Well, they didn't lose a single one. So just simple things like that where you can go, well, that's a risk, but the cost of fixing that risk isn't particularly high. And those sorts of things apply all around the place. Head walls on bridges and culverts to stop scour and things like that. Just little things can often make quite a difference. And so that's where your risk analysis drops in there. Lifecycle management in the middle here, this is the engine room. So you're looking at your operational costs and programs, your maintenance costs and programs, your renewal costs and programs, your new capital, and then ultimately your disposal. And they're all driven by what service am I trying to provide? Have I got enough of this asset? Do I need more? Have I got capacity? The demand, including sustainability and climate change demand and adaptation, and what do I need to do to meet that, and my risks. And you can't meet everything because there's never enough money. So it's always trade-offs, but you do all that and you work out the best programs that you can and the costs that you can from there. The optimisation side of that is then looking at, sometimes you can do more maintenance and less renewal, or you can do more renewal and less maintenance. So it's all of those sorts of trade-offs. Dr. Henning is a pretty worldwide expert on areas of optimisation. So if you're wanting to know the nitty-gritty of that, you have the man in the room when he's here to ask those sorts of questions. I mean, his expertise in that is quite widely recognised. So, and then out of that, you produce a set of financials. And the financials will be expenditure lines for operations and maintenance, renewals, capitals, and maybe depending on the jurisdiction you're in, depreciation. New Zealand's quite interesting because we are required to cash fund depreciation. Not many places in the world that's the case. Most cases it's a book entry in the accounting. And then, hey, well, how are we actually going to pay for that? So there's fees, charges, tariffs, loans, government grants, other funding. In the US, they have municipal bonds and some other jurisdictions. So you go out to the market and you raise a bond. So all of those ways are ways of funding. So that's easy, isn't it? Good, you can all go and write an asset plan. But what happens is the minute you start doing this, you realise you've got gaps. So, hey, here's the service level we like, but we're not delivering that, or we've got gaps in that. Here's the demand we think that's happening, but we've got no way of meeting it, or we've got gaps in the asset provision. Here's the risks that we've analysed, but we haven't got enough insurance, or one of those risks is too high and we haven't got the money to resolve it, and on it goes. So the thing is that you end up looking at the gaps and then saying, well, if we try to resolve those gaps, what happens to our lifecycle management program? The other thing that happens is you get over here to the financials and everybody goes, wow, that's way too much money. And to give you a tiny little example, I said we did whole of Solomon Islands school system. The Solomon Islands has got fairly high growth, 4% population growth year on year. and they haven't got enough schools. And so we sat down, did a growth model, said, hey, this is how many schools you need to build. And it was, at the end of the day, the annual figure, compared with what they're spending now, was 10 times more. So they're spending like 250, 300 million Solomon Islands dollars a year on their school system. They need to be spending about 2.5 to 3 billion on the asset side of it, not the teaching side of it, just building new schools and building new classrooms and stuff like that. And so what happened, and we knew this was going to happen when we produced this, what the first instinct of any regulator or whatever at that point is to shoot the messenger. Okay, I don't like what you're telling me, so you're wrong, go away. So that's what they did to us, and we knew they were going to. And they'll have a time to sulk about that, as governments do. And then they'll come back and they'll have a look at all the numbers and they'll go, oh yeah, those guys were pretty right. Oh, well, how are we going to afford this? And that's a different conversation. Okay, but the thing is, even here in New Zealand, with roads and with utilities and with public facilities, parks and that, there's always this conversation about, well, hang on, now we know what the total cost of this is, we haven't got enough money. People aren't prepared to pay. And it's this willingness to pay versus the cost of infrastructure. Now, the silly thing is, everybody's willing to pay for a data plan on their cell phone, you know, or free text minutes or whatever it is that you're paying for. Everybody's prepared to pay for a coffee or a juice every morning, but they're not prepared to pay for infrastructure. And one of the reasons for that is we take infrastructure for granted. You know, I hop in the car and I go drive the roads there. You know, it's always been there, hasn't it? You know, and people don't actually think about the fact that there's a whole lot of money required in behind the scenes. So, to some extent, it's an interesting argument because when infrastructure fails, people are very prepared to pay because it's just like, oh, we need it back. But it's a tension in any infrastructure management in any country. The tension is there's always more requirement for infrastructure costs than there is preparedness to pay. And so that's where you get back into this loop of going, well, hey, if you don't want to pay for it, what do you want to drop out of here? Because it's got to be levels of service have either got to drop, or else we've got our demand analysis wrong, or else you're prepared to accept a whole lot more risk. And the really interesting problem with politicians is they don't understand risk well, and engineers aren't that particularly good at telling them about it. And so then you get quite large failures sometimes because the risk hasn't been explained. So these plans are a mechanism for getting all this stuff out in the open and having a discussion about it. So just to summarise on asset plans, then we're going to look at some examples. It is an excellent framework for the development of the analysis and the management strategies for infrastructure assets. Once you've written an AMP, and you always have an improvement plan, you must implement them. We've seen time and time again in New Zealand, some authorities have gone, oh yeah, I've got a requirement to write an AMP, so they go and write the AMP, and then it just sits on the shelf and they do nothing with it. Well, why waste your time? Well, they have to because they don't get some money if they don't, so that's what drives them. But it's just an ongoing process of improvement of information and of planning, of thinking, of understanding risk and demand and level of service trade-offs and life cycle trade-offs and things like that. So if you take away one message about asset plans is once they're written, they must be implemented because otherwise they just sit on a shelf. In fact, in terms of my consulting practice now, if I think they're going to be an organisation where it sits on the shelf, I will refuse to work for them because I just can't be bothered. I don't want to spend 3 months of my life writing something that nobody reads. What's the point? Got better things to do. So in terms of service levels, what I thought I'd look at, this is the New Zealand, I don't know if you've heard of the One Network Road Classification. Those of you who've done any work in transportation in New Zealand will know about it. So the way that you manage roads generally is you set up a hierarchy from, hey, it's a really important road, so an interstate or a major national highway in overseas, or what we call the expressways, the motorways here in Auckland, down to a gravel road that goes into a farm or a couple of farms. And we had these hierarchies in New Zealand, but every single roading authority, of which there's 70 odd plus the state highway network, had their own variation on the hierarchy. And we did some work about 3 or 4 years ago. There was a thing called the Road Maintenance Task Force that the Minister of Transport organised. He wanted to know, could we save maintenance costs? And one of the things that came out of it was, hey, none of us are on the same page, even though we have sort of similar hierarchies. Everybody has slightly different hierarchies and they have slightly different service levels. So the One Network road classification has been an attempt to bring all of New Zealand's roads into the same classification and the same description, so that then you can say, hey, for this type of road, so this one here, let's say a primary collector, anywhere in New Zealand, they should all be the same sort of road, and they should, and at the end of the day, with a bit of variation, have the same sort of service levels. And this has been causing a lot of angst at the moment as we transition in the New Zealand transportation industry, because everybody goes, oh, they're going to take my money off me. Yep, probably. And all the money's going to go to Auckland. Yep, that's probably true as well. So the thing is, people have been stressing about this, but we've got this hierarchy now. So we've got national roads, and then we have regional arterials, primary collectors, secondary collectors, and access. And so it's around the number of traffics, ordinary traffics, around heavy traffic, it's around pedestrians, it's around traffic movements per day, and a whole lot of others. So all these factors that go across here, you put your road in a hierarchy like that. Then, this was a slide I used up in Canada in July, and I take photos for a hobby, so I was putting in photos in these slides to sort of try and get Canadians and Americans to go, oh, New Zealand's nice, we should come here. So this is Mount Cook, that's St David's Dome, that's Mount Cook, and this photo was taken from the visitor centre at Mount Cook on a July afternoon a couple of years ago. So the thing is, the ONRC service levels within those categories are looking at value for money, safety, resilience, amenity, travel time, reliability, and accessibility. And you look at those and you go, well, they're pretty good. That's, you know, and each of that road, so if we go back to that road hierarchy, so each of those hierarchies has one of these. So there's what, 10, you know, there's about 60 service levels or whatever it comes out of. And this is still getting developed as we speak. But for any road, that's actually not a bad, I don't think that's a bad set of service levels. I think that covers it pretty well. So the thing is that you can then go, well, hey, what does resilience mean for a national road versus an access road? And it might mean the weak points get armoured up. It might be that you've got alternate routes. It might be that you're looking at what critical services would be interrupted if you lose that bit of road, those sorts of things. So, and on it goes. And this one here, the top one, the value for money is quite a key driver because there's never enough money. And so the question is, you know, for Kaikoui or for up far north, how do you measure that against something in Gisborne or something in Canterbury or something in Southland or something in Auckland? And so those are the stresses and the questions, and trying to even that out is quite a job across the country. In terms of utilities, so this is water, wastewater and stormwater, but primarily water and wastewater. I've done reviews of like a lot of utility service levels when I've done peer reviews, and I pulled a whole lot of those out when I did these slides again for the North American conference back in July. And these are the common themes. So the common themes are, yes, safeguard public health and safety. Well, yeah, that's pretty, yeah, that's, and Havelock, the Havelock water crisis, which you hopefully have heard about just recently, where people got Campylobacter through the water supply, and there was, you know, a whole heap of people got sick for a couple of weeks. That was a failure of that particular service level. And the minute you do, it really hits the headlines, doesn't it, if you make a whole lot of people sick. And management of environmental impacts, so that's more for wastewater and perhaps for stormwater. You don't want to be ruining the environment as you discharge. When you have a break or a blockage or an overflow or whatever it is, people want to know that you're organised to respond reasonably quickly to that. You can measure your satisfaction, say, look, do you like the water? Oh no, my water's red and it stains my clothes when it's in the washing machine and it tastes terrible and I can't drink it. That's a dissatisfied person. So versus, oh, my water's really clean and it's pure and you know, we all like drinking it and all those sorts of things. And I don't get sick when I drink it. And financial performance is important as well. One of the things that's a bit interesting in terms of service levels and things like that, that we tend to forget about, is we have specialty assets. So this one's the Boston. They built this new bridge that's iconic for Boston, US. This one's the Tarawera footbridge in Hawke's Bay, sorry, not Taranaki, with Mount Taranaki behind it. And it's just on a cycleway, walkway that runs along the coast. And I think that was like $13 million for a footbridge. And you go, woo! Why would you spend $13 million on a footbridge? Because they wanted something that's going to be in every photo of Taranaki. Because the council didn't pay for it all. They raised money from the oil companies and the power company. You know, they did public fundraising. And because they wanted to create a really iconic asset. The thing is about these two here is you're going to maintain, the service levels for them are quite different from your general service levels. So when you're having general service levels, you can go, oh yeah, I need to fix that bridge because it's on a major road and I need to do this and I need to do this. And then you get these specialty or iconic assets. And they have their own little specialist service level demand because they create their own demand. And so just something to keep in, and heritage assets are the same thing at the other end of the scale. If you've got a very old asset, you know, let's take a really iconic example. Taj Mahal. If you were doing an asset management plan for the Taj Mahal, you're going to go, am I only going to, you know, clean it once every 50 years? Probably not. Probably I want to be doing a little bit more than that. You know, am I only going to prune the gardens once a year? Well, no, there's like 30,000 people a day go through that site. Maybe I want to, you know, do my litter pickup every day or half day, and all those sorts of things. So it becomes its own little. We don't have that many iconic heritage stuff in New Zealand because we're a bit young, but we do have the odd one. So heritage and specialist assets almost end up getting managed as their own case, and it's when you're managing a whole network or you're managing a whole portfolio of assets, keep your eyes out for these sorts of ones because they have quite different management plans from the general stuff and quite different cost structures, and often a lot of prohibition about what you can and can't do with them as well, particularly the heritage stuff. Right, levels of service. Where are we for time? Okay, yeah. So levels of service, cost and risk. So again, this came out of the Road Maintenance Task Force work, and one of the things we said is that there's this 3 axes. And levels of service, you can say, hey, well, I've got these levels of service and they're going to cost me here this much. And over here, remember I said to you earlier, the risk is often hidden. There's risk. And the problem is that when we're doing our planning, we can see this stuff and we can talk about this to politicians and decision makers and managers and the community. What nobody can see generally is this until it manifests itself. And in times of financial constraint, which we've been in, and right across, you know, certainly the Northern Hemisphere has had a real whack at that recently. What tends to happen is people are, I want to drop the dollars, I don't want to spend as much. So you drop your dollars, and your levels of service start sliding down that axis, that change axis. But it'll take a while, you know, that we're talking 5 years, maybe a decade change, because assets don't change that quickly, but they do start changing, be it roads or water supplies or whatever. And this hidden risk starts going up, but you don't know. So Flint is a water supply in the US. And just to give you a very brief background, it used to be a major manufacturing hub of automotive manufacturing. They used to dump all their waste products into the river beside the town, which was completely polluted. So polluted that the auto manufacturers will not take water out of it for their manufacturing processes. So just keep that in your mind. The town was taking its water from Detroit, which was taking its water from the Great Lakes. So really good, clean water, but it was really expensive. Auto factories all closing, town's down on its luck, people can't pay for the water, so they're starting to go, you know, they're going into bankruptcy. So the town council can't deal with it. The equation just doesn't work for them. But they decide that the way to fix the problem is to create a regional water supply that's got a different source. There's about 5 or 7 towns, and it'll be, you know, like say half the price of the Detroit water, so that'll solve the problem. So, and they can balance their books and everybody be happy. So what they did was they went down that pathway and they didn't renew their contracts with Detroit. But the trouble was the regional water supply got held up. both the permits and consents and everybody agreeing to it. And they got in this situation where we've got no water coming this way and this one's not ready. What are we going to do? Now, you know what they did. They decided that they were going to take the water out of the Flint River, which was highly polluted. And everybody said that's a really terrible idea, and somebody decided it was a good idea. So they took this water and it was like brown gloop. But it was worse than that. The town had lead service lines coming in from the water mains to the houses. It was that in that era when in the US when they were using lead. And the acidity of the water they were taking out of the river released lead on the service line. So without doing the sampling in that, they changed the conditions. And then they started having all these kids throwing up with, not throwing up, but they started lead poisoning. And the trouble with lead poisoning, if you know anything about it, is once lead's in your system as a human being, it never gets out, and it causes brain retardation and learning and difficulties. And these kids were lower socio, mainly African American, but lower socio, poor children basically. So to save money, they took water in that poisoned poor children. So politically, I mean, the president of the US weighed in on this. The Senate and the Congress weighed. You're this little town. It is, in American terms, a very small town, and you've got the president, the Congress, the Senate, the governor, everybody wading in on you. So, but in terms of this, our discussion around asset planning, so that's the backstory to it. So in terms of our discussion, they dropped the level of service because they wanted to save money. They had this risk, and they crossed the threshold of safety and trust. And the costs there are going to be, I think they might have saved themselves $20 or $30 million in what they did. And the costs will be a minimum of $500 million US and could be closer to $1 billion. By the time they fix the water supply, settle all the class actions, and they'll have lifelong health costs that somebody will have to pay for all the people that were injured. Pretty expensive mistake. Now, the interesting thing about that threshold of safety and trust is you can spend heaps of dollars and get your level of service up to, and you can get your risk back down, but you'll never get your trust back. So as infrastructure managers, if you build something that fails, or you have a failure sequence like that one at Flint that's just recent, once you lose your trust, so in dictatorships, if you get on the wrong side of the ruling party or whatever and you lose their trust and you embarrass them, generally you don't survive that process, or they throw you in jail at the very best, In a Western democracy, we're not quite as harsh as that, but we do throw, people go to jail for things like this. But you have legislation, you have regulations, you have the cost of alternative actions, you have litigation, you have the overall societal costs, and you'll have much more requirements to inspect and investigate. So in New Zealand terms, in terms of that Havelock North water incident that's just been, all of those things will come out of that. We've got a commission of inquiry underway right now with that'll report middle of next year. So again, they've already got it back to safe. They had it back to safe within 24, 48 hours of knowing what was going wrong. Winning trust back when infrastructure fails is a much bigger problem. So the other thing is, this is the Minnesota Bridge in the US. I don't know if you remember, it was 2007, it collapsed, killed 13 people, 145 issued. This is the Mississippi River. So, and it made worldwide news at the time. They dropped a bridge into the Mississippi River while they were repairing it, by the way. And the thing was, if you go back to the 1970s and 80s in engineering, there were quite high factors of safety built into things, maybe 2, 3, 4 time factor of safety for civil design, for construction and stuff like that. As we've tried to take cost and become more efficient out of the system, we've taken factors of safety out, but we don't know, because if we go back to that hidden risk, that's your factors of safety, but we don't know and we can't explain as engineers or asset managers how much we're taking out and what it's doing to our risk. And so the net result is the Flint type incidents, or this. Once you take, you'll get a spectacular failure of a system or a process, civil engineering wise, or a dam or whatever it is. People die and it's all, very spectacular. But it's all about losing factors of safety through changing service levels and changing costs. So asset plans help you examine this sort of stuff. But this is the wrong end of it. If you're the asset manager for that bridge, that's not a good day in your life. It took them 18 months to build a new one. And that was like on a major interstate, so it really stuffed up the traffic flows in the city for 18 months as well. This is a different example. So this was Walkerton in Canada in 2000. So what happened there, they had some bores that they had cows around and they got E. coli, a particular type of E. coli that's carried in cow manure into the bores. Because they'd set up a contract where they had a performance-based contract with the contractor, if they hadn't got the chlorine in that, got massive financial penalties. It just so happened that the guy who was the contractor was the brother of the guy who was running the town water supply. So there was a little bit of a conflict of interest there. So rather than put their hand up the minute they knew about it, said, hey, we've got cow poo in our water supply and you should boil the water and not drink it for a while, they didn't say anything for 3 or 4 days. And at that time, I think it was like 7 people dead and 1,500 people ill. And they had a massive inquiry. One of the brothers went to jail, the other one got a community sentence. The 7 people who were dead didn't get to come back. Some of those people who are ill have lifelong injuries from it, like they'll never recover. But over here in New Zealand, our public health officials looked at that and said, hey, nothing to stop that happening in New Zealand, so we ended up with water safety plans, about $1 billion of capital on small town water treatment, increased long-term operations and maintenance costs, and increased levels of service, which were increased costs. So that was in Canada, and it caused all these costs here in New Zealand. And Flint is going to do the same thing to New Zealand as is Havelock. So what happens is that people go, oh, there's that risk, but we don't know how to manage it. So what do? We put legislation, regulations, costs go up. Whether we're actually managing the risk any better is anybody's guess. But coming back to this diagram here, those interrelationships and how they interact with life cycle management, that's what you describe in an asset plan, is quite important. It actually has real world consequences. And this bit's the bit we struggle to explain to decision makers the most, is the risk side of it, okay? So just so you know to watch out for that, and that's where the gotchas are. So in conclusion, in New Zealand we've had 20 years of asset plans and 7 cycles of development. We've got guidance available through all those plans and resources and templates for specific industries as well as across multiple industries. Levels of service, future demand and risk are the key inputs to life cycle analysis. If you try to do your asset life cycle analysis without those inputs, you will get it spectacularly wrong. Delivery of levels of service is fundamental. Those risks and hidden costs must be considered. Otherwise, you'll end up with the wrong set of conclusions and the wrong set of actions and the hidden risks. And if you write an asset plan and then the authority, or if you're in that authority, doesn't implement it, well then they're not going to be particularly useful. So I would encourage you to do that.